Usually when we talk about getting a medical diagnosis, there's this built-in expectation of precision. It almost feels like engineering.
Right. It's very mechanical.
Yeah, exactly. You go to the ER, you break your arm, the X-ray prints out, and there it is. There's this jagged white line on a black background.
You can physically point to it.
Right. The doctor points to it and says, there's the fracture. It's visible. It's categorized. And honestly, that kind of clarity is incredibly comforting.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Because it creates a sense of control. The problem is completely isolated to a specific coordinate in physical space.
But the moment we transition into the diagnostic landscape of our own lives, like our projects, our relationships, our internal operating systems, that X-ray machine just totally shatters.
It becomes incredibly murky.
Yeah.
Very fast.
Right. And yet we still desperately want that clean binary X-ray. When a business venture fails or, say, a friendship fractures, we want to point to a single visible break.
We look for a villain. Or, we just blame a stroke of bad luck.
Exactly. We are essentially looking for a broken bone in an X-ray of a ghost. It just doesn't exist. So today, for you listening, we are taking the misassessed document, which is the second part of our masterclass sources, and we are going to use it to build a completely new diagnostic machine.
I love that framing. Because we're exploring how a meta practitioner actually calculates reality, decodes their failures, and systematically updates their operating system.
Yeah, we are dissecting the really heavy-hitting mechanics today. We're talking about things like implicative secrets, linear reality deduction, and we'll eventually map the 5-step Praxis protocol directly onto the 4 parameters, the 4DP framework.
It's a dense text, but the payoff is massive.
Huge. But before we get into how to decode a mistake, we really have to look at the machinery of how a meta practitioner calculates reality in the first place.
Right, the baseline functioning.
Exactly. The source material issues this very strict mandate for our analysis today. It states that the approach to this document must be, and I quote, epically comprehensible and imperatively implicative.
That second phrase is a mouthful.
Let's pause on that, right? Imperatively implicative sounds incredibly dense. I mean, it almost feels like the author is trying to obfuscate the point rather than clarify it.
It does, yeah. It carries a certain academic weight. But the phrase is actually a set of operational instructions when you really break it down.
How so?
Well, imperative obviously indicates a vital command, right? Something you absolutely cannot ignore. And implicative points to inference, the secondary truths that are automatically suggested by a primary fact.
Okay, so it's not just big words for the sake of it.
No, not at all. When the text demands that this material be imperatively implicative, it's essentially arguing that the structural math of life we're about to discuss shouldn't need endless hand-holding to grasp.
Right.
The profound implications of these concepts should become completely obvious to you by inference. Once you understand the core equation of how reality is generated, the implications for your own specific struggles become, well, an unavoidable command.
You see the code, and suddenly the necessity of changing your own behavior just becomes undeniable. And that leads us directly into this concept of linear reality deduction. This is basically how an experienced meta practitioner calculates generative reality. Now, I want to clarify for you listening right now, we are not discussing some kind of mystical foresight here.
Oh, no, no crystal balls.
Right. This has absolutely nothing to do with gazing into the future through intuition or manifesting or whatever.
Far from it. Linear reality deduction is a rigorous, almost clinical process of observation and synthesis.
Break that down for us.
So, you look at a specific set of circumstances, you apply specific pressure points, and you deduce that under this specific lighting, within this specific environment, only X, Y, and Z outcomes are mathematically possible.
So it's about constraints.
Exactly. You are calculating the inevitable trajectory of the variables that are currently in play.
Okay, let's ground this in the source material because I want to keep this epically comprehensible. The text uses the chapter called Within to demonstrate this. Specifically, it looks at how the traveler generated the four-square layout.
Right, the root square chart.
Yes, and this is where the terminology gets a little heavy, so let's unpack it. What exactly are we looking at with this four-square layout? What is it?
Well, the four-square layout is basically the base architecture the traveler used to map their reality. But the crucial point the source makes here is how that layout was generated in the first place.
Because it wasn't just an aesthetic choice, right?
Exactly. The traveler didn't just sit down with a blank piece of paper and think, you know what, 4 boxes look really nice.
Right.
The text explicitly states that this specific framework was mathematically deduced. It was based on the traveler's internal pressures, their specific environmental contexts, and this is the key phrase, triadic cognitive grammar.
Okay, I have to stop you there because triadic cognitive grammar is a phrase that could easily lose people right off the bat. If we want this to be comprehensible, we need to unpack that mechanism.
Fair enough.
Are we just talking about, like, processing the world in sets of three?
I mean, essentially, yes. Cognitive grammar refers to the underlying rules by which a mind naturally structures information. So a triadic grammar means this particular mind inherently processes reality through the interaction of three distinct forces.
Like a thesis, an antithesis, and the tension between them.
Exactly like that. Now, if your mind inherently operates by tracking three moving variables constantly, and you are placed under immense environmental pressure to synthesize those variables into an actionable plan,
A four-part framework is the inevitable result.
you've got it. You have the three interacting forces, and that fourth space becomes the container or like the synthesis point that holds them all together.
Ah, I see.
So the four-square layout was the only structural container that could accurately hold that specific reality. The system yielded the need for the chart, and the chart yielded access to the system.
It's beautiful when you lay it out like that, but, and I have to push back here a little bit, if we say outcomes are mathematically deduced by the variables, aren't we completely ignoring the sheer chaos and randomness of the real world?
That's the classic objection, yeah.
Because, I mean, I could have the perfect triadic cognitive grammar, I could have perfect environmental awareness, I could apply the exact right pressure, and then, a piano falls on my head.
Right. The literal wild card.
Or, to use a more realistic scenario, let's say I deliver a flawless pitch with perfect data, but the client just had a terrible morning in traffic and says no. How is a random rejection or an act of God a failure of my so-called math?
I'm glad you brought this up.
Because it sounds dangerously close to a philosophy that blames the individual for variables entirely outside their control. And that's a dangerous path.
It is, and that's the critical distinction we have to make. It's a trap so many people fall into when studying these metasystems. Linear reality deduction does not claim that you control all the variables.
Okay, so what does it claim?
It claims that you must accurately calculate the variables that are present, and that includes the volatility of the environment itself.
Oh, I see. So the volatility is a variable.
Yes. If you pitch a client who is known for erratic behavior, or you don't account for the fact that a client might be having a bad day, and you fail to factor that human unpredictability into your equation, your math is flawed.
Okay.
The piano falling on your head is the ultimate chaotic variable, sure. But the meta-practitioner doesn't claim omnipotence. They don't control the universe. They claim observational supremacy.
Observational supremacy. That's a great term.
They calculate the highest probability pathways based on the intersection of their internal output and the external conditions. That's it.
So it's really akin to baking chemistry.
Perfect analogy.
But it's acknowledging that things like altitude and ambient humidity are part of the equation. Like if you mix a specific ratio of flour, yeast, and water and apply exactly 400 degrees of heat, you aren't sitting there hoping for bread.
No, bread is the linear, mathematically deduced outcome of those variables.
Exactly. But if your oven is broken and you didn't check it, the failure isn't because the fundamental chemistry of bread is flawed. Right. The failure is because you didn't factor the broken oven into your reality deduction.
That analogy holds up perfectly. You are arranging the variables within your sphere of influence to inevitably generate a result, while simultaneously remaining hyper-aware of the variables outside your control.
And if you, listening to this right now, look at your current life through this lens, it changes literally everything.
It really does.
If your daily variables consist of, chronic stress, insufficient sleep, and a total lack of deep focus, you cannot mathematically deduce an outcome of vibrant creative output.
The chemistry simply does not support it. You cannot get bread.
You have to stop hoping the oven will magically bake a cake when you put in the ingredients for a casserole.
Exactly.
Which brings us to the inevitable pain point in all of this. If linear reality deduction is the science of calculating what should happen based on our variables, what do we call it when our calculation is violently rejected by reality?
We call it a mistake.
A mistake. And this takes us deep into the Mrs. S document itself, which outlines the actual physics of mistakes.
This section of the text is a profound paradigm shift. And honestly, it requires a level of emotional detachment that most people find very, very uncomfortable at first.
Yeah, the document introduces a core thesis that just completely strips away a lot of our psychological comfort blankets.
It leaves nowhere to hide.
It argues that framing, attention, intention, and ignorance do not alter the laws of the material world. Physics is not secretly reading your reasons.
That line alone is devastating. We spend an enormous amount of psychological energy trying to convince reality to grade us on a
We
curve.
really do.
When a project fails, our first line of defense is almost always, but I meant well, or I was trying my absolute best, or I didn't know that rule applied.
Right. We treat intention as if it's a physical force, like it should somehow mitigate the consequences of our actions. We want the universe to audit our hearts, not our results.
Precisely. But the material world does not possess an auditing mechanism for human intention.
It's blind to it.
Totally blind. Two people can inhabit the exact same physical space, governed by the exact same material laws, but arrive at entirely different consequences. Why? Because they placed different things in different relations under different interpretations.
So intention only gets you so far.
Your intention only influences what you choose to place in the oven. It doesn't change how the heat interacts with the ingredients once the door is closed.
The Miss document provides a very specific, almost clinical definition of a mistake to reinforce this. Let me read it. It states, a mistake belongs to the failed fit between a person's operative reading and the indifferent conditions that answered it.
The phrasing there is deeply intentional. Failed fit
Mhm.
in different conditions.
I really want to focus on that phrase in different conditions
Yeah.
because I think this is where the human ego puts up the biggest fight. When we experience a massive failure, it feels personal.
Always.
It feels hostile. The mind almost prefers to believe that the universe is actively malicious rather than entirely indifferent. Why is indifference so much harder for us to process than malice?
Well, because malice implies a relationship.
Oh, wow.
Right. If the universe, or a market, or your industry is actively out to get you, it means you are important enough to be targeted.
Your ego gets to remain at the center of the narrative, even if it's a tragic narrative.
Exactly. Indifference, however, is radically decentralizing. The conditions of the market didn't reject your product because they hate you.
Right.
They rejected it because it did not solve a problem they care about. Your operative reading of what the market wanted was simply a failed fit with the indifferent conditions of the market's actual needs.
So accepting indifference requires you to accept that your internal narrative has literally zero mass in the external world.
It has no weight. It doesn't move the needle at all.
That is a staggering realization. But it's also incredibly freeing, isn't it? If the conditions are truly indifferent and a mistake is nothing more than a failed fit, then a failure is fundamentally stripped of moral judgment.
It's no longer a referendum on your soul.
Right. It ceases to be an indictment and becomes a data point.
And this is the crux of how a meta-practitioner emotionally processes a mistake. They decode all failures as stack trace data.
Okay, let's explain that term for those outside the software development world. A stack trace is a highly detailed diagnostic report.
Yes.
When a piece of software crashes, the system automatically generates a stack trace that shows the exact sequence of functions that were called right up to the moment of failure. It literally points to the specific line of code that caused the entire system to halt.
And crucially, the programmer does not look at a stack trace and suffer an existential crisis about their worth as a human being.
Right. They don't stare at the computer screen and think, oh God, line 42 failed. I am fundamentally broken and unlovable.
No, they read the data, they see that a variable was null or a syntax error caused an infinite loop, they rewrite the line, and they compile the code again.
And the MISS text argues that we must apply this exact diagnostic detachment to the three main domains of our lives where we experience mismatch.
Yes. The first domain is runtime failures. This encompasses our work, our code, our art, really any physical or intellectual structures we build.
And the text is absolutely adamant that a runtime failure is not proof of stupid code. Because when we pour our soul into a creative project, like a novel or a marketing campaign or a piece of music, and it falls completely flat, the emotional instinct is to view it as proof of our inadequacy.
We take it so personally.
Of course we do.
But the stack trace perspective tells you that the failure is highly specific data. It is reality telling you that a structural variable was missing.
Give me an example.
Sure. Let's say you read a novel. Perhaps the pacing of the novel failed to hook the reader's attention within the first 10 pages. Or in business, perhaps your marketing campaign utilized a platform where your target demographic simply doesn't spend time.
So the failure is just a neutral indicator of a missing bracket or a misaligned gear. It is not an assessment of your potential as a creator.
Exactly. Now, domain 2 is where this methodology becomes intensely difficult to apply. and that is social ruptures. We are talking about intimacy, leadership, arguments, burnt bridges. When a relationship fractures, the pain is visceral. It feels entirely like humiliation or betrayal.
It is the domain where our ego defenses are the most heavily fortified, without a doubt.
But the meta-practitioner must view even a social rupture as stack trace data. A blown argument isn't merely a personal disaster.
What is it then?
It is specific information regarding your timing, your tone, your projection onto the other person, or your failure to establish a shared reality.
The source material provides a brilliant and honestly almost agonizingly relatable example of this, the Aunt Carol Thanksgiving field confusion.
Classic.
Let's really break this down because the text uses some heavy terminology to describe a very, very common family dynamic. So picture this. You are at the Thanksgiving table. Aunt Carol leans over the mashed potatoes and asks, "Still single? When are you going to settle down and get a real job?"
She is the quintessential threshold guardian. She is testing your frame.
Right. Now, previously, you might have just grimaced and endured it, maybe vented to your friend later. But you've been reading meta theory, you've been doing the work, and you decide to deploy your shiny new intellectual framework on Aunt Carol.
A dangerous game.
Very. You look at her across the table and say, "Aunt Carol, I am currently occupying the autonomous variable 1 position. You are attempting to coerce me into a responsive variable position. Let us find the third in this relational field so we can engage in conscious co-creation."
A response which guarantees absolute systemic failure.
Utter failure. Aunt Carol simply stares at you, deeply uncomfortable, thinks you've joined a cult, and asks you to pass the gravy.
And the novice meta-practitioner, frustrated that their brilliant framework isn't being respected, doubles down and yells, "The gravy is a capacitant shadow, Carol."
And the entire dinner is ruined. It's a massive social rupture.
It's hilarious, but it happens, and the temptation there is to blame Aunt Carol for being unevolved.
She just doesn't get it.
Right. Or to blame yourself for being a freak who can't interact with normal people. But neither of those emotional reactions is actually useful. We have to read the stack trace.
Okay, so what does the data actually show us in that interaction? Let's define the terms first. When you claim the autonomous variable 1 position, you are claiming to be a self-generating agent acting from your own center, right?
Yes.
And you are accusing Aunt Carol of trying to make you a responsive variable, meaning someone who merely reacts to her frame and her judgments.
Exactly. And the third refers to the shared neutral ground, where two autonomous agents can meet to co-create an interaction rather than just fighting for dominance.
And the capacitant shadow gravy.
That's the hidden unresolved energy or tension in the room that no one is naming.
But the stack trace reveals that deploying these concepts at a family dinner is a catastrophic failure of timing and tone.
It's a massive mismatch.
You experience severe field confusion. You expected a level 3 conscious, integrated co-creation from a level 1 unconscious broadcasting environment. Aunt Carol's living room is governed by entirely different social physics than a developmental psychology seminar.
The rupture did not occur because you are unlovable, nor did it occur because the theories are wrong.
Right.
The rupture occurred because you attempted to run complex, high-bandwidth software on legacy hardware.
That's a perfect way to put it.
You use jargon as a weapon to establish superiority, fundamentally misunderstanding the indifferent conditions of the relational field you were in. The stack trace data instruct you to calibrate your language and your expectations to the environment next time.
Which brings us to the final domain, competitive losses. So this is play, strategy, business negotiations.
A repeated loss in a competitive arena is not a cosmic signal that you should give up.
It's not a sign from the universe.
No, it is meta-information about your build, your rhythm, your pattern recognition, and your resource management. If a chess player repeatedly loses to a specific opening, the data isn't saying they are unintelligent.
Right.
The data is saying their defensive structure against that specific vector is mathematically flawed.
And this distills down to the foundational, undeniable rule of the Miss document. I want everyone listening to hear this. Mismatch becomes instruction when interpreted instead of merely endured.
That is the core sentence.
Let that sink in. Mismatch becomes instruction when interpreted instead of merely endured.
Because if you simply endure the humiliation of the loss, the rupture, or the failure, you extract zero value from the pain.
You suffer for nothing.
Literally.
Yeah.
You suffer the cost of the mistake without acquiring the asset it generates, which is the data.
The natural question then is how? How do we actually stop enduring and start interpreting? How do we process the raw code of the stack trace without getting defensive?
And that is the engine of today's deep dive.
Exactly. To interpret the stack trace data, the MISS document gives us the 5-step Praxis protocol. And to ensure this is epically comprehensible, we are going to strictly map these 5 steps onto the 40P life architecture framework: target, truth, totally, and title.
This mapping is where the theoretical philosophy becomes an executable operating system. It's where it becomes real.
Okay, let's get into it. We begin with Praxis step 1. Name the intended outcome without euphemism.
This maps directly to the first parameter of the 40P target.
Now, a target in this framework is distinctly different from a conventional goal, isn't it? Like a goal is a destination. I want to earn $1 million or I want to publish a book. But a target, as defined by the text, is a directional focus. It is a heading.
If you are navigating a wilderness, your goal might be a specific cabin, but your target is north.
Ah, okay.
The terrain is going to shift. You will encounter obstacles, maybe a river you can't cross, or a mountain you must walk around, which means your immediate path will absolutely deviate from a straight line.
You'll be walking east for a while just to get around the mountain.
Exactly. Yeah. But your target remains north. It is the continuous orientation of your effort, regardless of the immediate terrain.
But the Praxis protocol demands a very specific condition here. You must name the target without euphemism. Why is the absence of euphemism so critical to the diagnostic process?
Because a euphemism is fundamentally a psychological defense mechanism. It's designed to obscure reality.
Give me an example.
When we are afraid of failing, we soften our targets. We say things like, well, I'm just going to put this project out there and see what happens.
I've said that so many times.
We all do it. Or in a relationship context, we're just hanging out, seeing where things go.
We hedge our bets because if we never firmly state what we actually want, we can never definitively fail to get it.
Exactly. But if we return to the stack trace metaphor, you cannot decode a failure if you feed the diagnostic system corrupted input.
Right.
If you tell the system that your target was just seeing where things go, the system cannot calculate a gap when things fall apart.
Because there was no fixed point. The data becomes useless.
To extract instruction from a mismatch, you have to be absolutely brutal with your own ego. You must state, my target was to secure a committed partnership, or my target was to capture 20% of the market share.
Only when the target is named without euphemism does the data have a true north to orient against.
Precisely. Which flows seamlessly into Praxis step 2. Name the actual result.
And this maps to the second parameter of the 40P, truth.
Now, truth in the 40P framework isn't about moral honesty, like, I didn't steal the cookie.
Right, it's bigger than that.
It is about...
Exactly. Or the relationship ended, but they were emotionally unavailable anyway, so honestly, I actually dodged a bullet.
We immediately try to rebrand the failure as a hidden victory.
And the moment you do that, you destroy the integrity of the stack trace.
You ruin the data. Truth demands that you shut down the internal PR department and just name the actual result. We ran out of funding and the company's insolvent.
Period.
The client chose our competitor. My partner left me.
It is agonizing to hold that truth. But logically, if your target was north, and the truth forces you to admit that you are currently standing 50 miles south, you finally have the 2 coordinates required to calculate the distance of the mismatch.
The gap is defined.
The gap is defined. And investigating that gap brings us to Praxis step 3. Isolate where the mismatch entered. The protocol specifically instructs us to locate the failure in one of 3 areas: missing knowledge, malformed reasoning, or collapsed care.
And this corresponds to the third parameter of the 40P.
Oh, totally. Now, this parameter asks a highly confronting question of the listener. Were you all in, or were you hedging? It measures the totality of your engagement.
When you look at the gap between target and truth, you are looking for the exact moment the system failed. If the mismatch entered through missing knowledge, it means your totality was compromised by a blind spot.
You literally didn't know what you needed to know.
Right. You did not possess the necessary data to accurately calculate the reality deduction. You didn't research the market thoroughly enough, or you didn't understand the psychological needs of your partner.
Okay, what if the knowledge was there, but the outcome still failed?
Then the mismatch might be malformed reasoning. You had all the ingredients, but your logic was flawed. You applied the wrong cognitive grammar to the situation.
Like using a wrench to hammer a nail.
Exactly. You assume that because a strategy worked perfectly in Sector A, it would automatically work in Sector B, fundamentally misreading the indifferent conditions of the new environment.
But the third area of mismatch collapsed care, I think this is the one that strikes the deepest nerve. Let's unpack collapsed care, because I really think it's the silent killer of totality.
It really is. Collapsed care occurs when both the knowledge and the reasoning are sound, but the sustained application of effort degrades over time.
It's the failure of endurance.
Yes, you start a venture with absolute commitment. You are tracking every metric, you are communicating clearly, you're totally dialed in. But as the friction of reality grinds against you week after week, month after month, your care begins to collapse.
You get tired.
You stop double-checking the code, you start relying on assumptions, you let minor miscommunications slide because you just don't have the energy for conflict.
Let's visualize an entrepreneur building a startup. In year one, they are obsessive about customer feedback. They are totally integrated.
Right, they answer every email.
But by year three, they are burned out. They stop answering support emails personally. They assume they know what the customer wants without asking anymore. When the startup inevitably loses its market edge, the stack trace won't show a lack of intelligence or a flawed product vision.
No.
The data will point to line 402, the exact quarter where the founders' care collapsed. They were no longer operating in totality. They were half in.
It is a devastating realization to look at the data and admit, I just stopped caring enough to execute. But again, we must rely on the emotional detachment of the meta practitioner here.
Right. Finding the exact moment your care collapsed is not a reason to drown in shame. It is the key to preventing the same failure in the next iteration. It highlights the specific threshold where your capacity requires reinforcement.
Exactly. Which means you need to build better system to support your endurance next time.
And that structural reinforcement begins in Praxis step 4. Identify what the event disclosed that could not have been fully known before the contact.
This maps to the fourth parameter of the 4DP, title.
Titles. Now, the source text defines titles as noun ships. We really need to clarify this terminology. What separates a noun ship from an identity?
An identity implies permanence. It is a fixed state of being that defines your core self. I am this.
Okay.
A noun ship, in this framework, is a temporary role. It is a functional title you assume to navigate a specific set of variables, and you discard it when it is no longer useful to you.
So how does the disclosure of new information from a failure force an update to our titles?
Well, think about it. When you make contact with reality, when the rubber actually meets the road and the failure occurs, the event always discloses information that was literally impossible to know beforehand.
You can theorize all day, but reality tests it.
Right. You cannot fully know the breaking point of a material until you actually break it. You cannot fully know the structural integrity of your relationship until it undergoes severe stress. The mistake reveals the hidden physics of the system.
The problem is how our brains react to that disclosure. If we don't understand noun ships, our brain's predictive engine will automatically assign us a fixed, permanent identity based on the failure.
Exactly. This is the danger. If you step onto a stage to give a keynote presentation and the technology fails, your pacing is totally off, and the audience literally falls asleep.
A nightmare scenario.
The event has disclosed that your preparation was inadequate for that specific environment. That's the stack trace data. But your brain won't interpret it that way.
No, your brain will whisper, I am a failure. I am an imposter. I am fundamentally incapable of public speaking.
And once you accept failure as a fixed identity, your brain, which is designed to seek confirmation of its beliefs, will scan your entire history to gather evidence supporting that title.
Oh, it will remind you of the time you stuttered in 3rd grade reading out loud.
It will build an impenetrable case against you. But the text argues that we can consciously override this by adopting a fluid title, a noun ship. Instead of I am a failure, you say I am the learner or I am the architect.
And that changes everything, because the title of learner changes the operating parameters of your consciousness. A learner is not broken by new information. A learner actually requires new information to function.
Beautifully put.
But let's get into the mechanics of the how, because it is incredibly easy for us to sit here in a studio and say, just call yourself the learner.
Much easier said than done.
Right. When you are standing on that stage, sweating through your shirt, watching an audience tune out, the shame is somatic. Your nervous system is flooded with cortisol. Your brain is screaming that you are a fraud. How does a meta practitioner actually interrupt that neurological loop in real time to adopt a new title?
It requires a deliberate, almost mechanical intervention. You cannot outthink an activated nervous system with sheer willpower. You have to run a disruptor protocol.
Walk us through the protocol.
First, you must externalize the state. You don't say, I am failing. You say internally or even out loud to yourself in the green room afterward, the system is currently outputting a failed state.
You separate the event from the self?
You look at the X-ray, rather than identifying as the broken bone.
Wow, that's powerful.
Once you create that cognitive distance, you actively assign the noun chip. You ask the diagnostic question, what is the learner required to extract from this failed state?
And just asking that question flips a switch.
The moment you frame the inquiry through the lens of the new title, the brain's predictive engine shifts gears. It stops scanning for evidence of your worthlessness and begins scanning the environment for tools, for solutions, for the exact nature of the missing knowledge.
I am the learner. The event disclosed that I don't know how to manage AV equipment under pressure. What is the immediate next step?
Exactly. You hold the identity lightly. It gives you the fluidity to adapt to the stack trace without shattering your core sense of self.
Which brings us to the final unifying step of the entire process, Praxis Step 5.